First Nations leaders had the chance today to ask questions and air their grievances on the implementation of Bill C-5, the federal major projects bill designed to fast-track projects in the national interest. Some chiefs told Prime Minister Mark Carney they were concerned that the bill trampled Indigenous rights, but one chief walked out of the summit early, citing several issues with the federal government.
I'm walking out. I mean, this whole thing has just been a complete disaster. They want to do billion-dollar projects, sidestepping all type of regulations. They can't even get a two-day event done properly. Leaves a lot to question at the end of the day.
I'm joined now by Indigenous Services Minister Mandy Gull-Masty. Minister, it's good to meet you. Thank you for being here today.
Pleasure.
I'd like to start there. You saw that's the Grand Chief of the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake, Cody Diabo, leaving the summit early. What's your response to that criticism and the other criticism we've heard throughout the day?
I had a conversation with Grand Chief Diabo. I think that today you saw for the first time an engagement session hosted by the Prime Minister with basically as many, not all, but as many Indigenous leadership that were present. That was a very large group. It is the first time that you're undertaking this type of meeting. There was room for improvement on some things, I could say, but I think the objective of the meeting to me was made clear in discussion. We are here to listen to you. We want to understand what you're looking for and where are you going with your interest in this process.
Some of the chiefs, though, we heard from today, Minister, they felt worse after this process. Some of the Alberta chiefs held a press conference with Senator Prosper today, and they compared this to the treaty promises of the past, saying it's reassuring words, but they don't believe it will actually be in their interest with this legislation and with this fast tracking of projects. I mean, how do you respond to concerns like that?
I think the Prime Minister addressed it in his closing comments. This process will take trust. This process, it was clear that there was varying degrees of trust in the room, but for me, it is a process. This is the first step. There's going to be many additional steps that we have to take to move forward, and that is not defined. That doesn't exist. This is something new. This is something that we're co-developing, that we are working on together. I can understand there was some frustration, but for me, I'm hoping that we learn from what we heard in this session and we continue to improve as we take those steps forward.
But some of the chiefs compared this to political theater, said there's a predetermined outcome. Your government made it very clear what the intention is here, right? To have the ability to fast track projects that they deem to be in the national interest. So like this process you're navigating here, if the end point is known, how meaningfully can they change the journey and the stops along the way?
Because one of the criteria of national interest also includes Indigenous interest. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the message that was shared today. If your nation or community has an interest to participate, if you have a project that you wish to submit and put forward, the likelihood of that project going from being a concept to actually being a project for national interest is going to be higher if you are prepared, if you want to participate, if it reflects feasibility, if it is something that we can do, and if there's interest from everybody who wants to participate.
So the Prime Minister has been reassuring, in his words, on the duty to consult and the Section 35 rights. And look, the Supreme Court wouldn't let you get away with not doing those things anyway. But there's a difference between consult and consent. And this is what some people are pointing to, that the commitment to adopt the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People speaks of free, prior, and informed consent. Help us understand what the threshold is for a project to go ahead to be considered in Indigenous interest if there isn't unanimity amongst the nations that are affected by it.
That's exactly one of the first criteria. You have to have Indigenous interest to get into this space for your project to advance. If there's no interest, then the likelihood of us as government pursuing it, to invest in it, to take it to realization is not there. So I think what I heard today from the Prime Minister is Section 35 is a baseline. That's a starting point. Sure. We have to go beyond that. We have to continue engagement. And for me, as a former Indigenous leader who probably would have been sitting in the audience 2 months ago, what I heard was there's opportunity for you to define something that is of concern. And I feel that the Prime Minister is open to having that dialogue and engaging in that way.
But we've seen with some projects in the past that predate this legislation that say a pipeline that goes through territory covered by multiple treaties and multiple groups. Some support, some oppose. What happens in that scenario? A scenario like that where there is not unanimity in all the areas touched and all the treaties touched by a project under this legislation. Does it not get fast-tracked? Does that effectively become a veto if consent is withheld by any of the groups touching this project?
Well, you know, Indigenous interest is very clear. It means that everybody wants to be involved. Everybody thinks this is a good opportunity for nation building. Everybody has committed to this process. I don't think it would make it past, you know, that first essential step of identifying interest. So for me, I think the probability of that kind of situation occurring with this new bill now is very low, if almost non-existent to me.
Well, see, in the private sector, some of the proponents who have been frustrated by what they consider to be regulatory impediments to building in Canada, they might look at that and say this fast tracking is not really going to fast track what we want to do. If, say, you have 10 groups, 8 are for it, 2 oppose. If the 2 opposing, it can't go ahead, then what is the value of it, right? So how do you balance these things as a government?
I think that talking to industry, they would be encouraged by this process. This means removing the burden of going to multiple ministries for approval. You come to one office, you get a clear message. All of the information that you submit is to one office. It is supported. There is a complementary process for Indigenous nations to also submit. There has to be unanimity at the table of interest. This is not a process that's going to be driven solely by government, solely by Indigenous people, or solely by industry.
Do you think you eased many of the concerns today? Because I mean, I wasn't in the room, obviously, but what I saw from people coming out, I don't know if things got better for your government on this legislation with First Nations leaders or worse today. I mean, what is your sense?
I think I heard all kinds of responses in my one-on-ones, in my meetings with various leaders. Yes, there were some people who had no interest, who didn't think that, you know, they were interested to take the next step. I also heard some communities that had projects that they wanted to put forward and submit. The degree is varying. I hope that, you know, those who are interested, their stories will be reflected, you know, over the next couple of days in the media as well.
Yeah, we had Chief Clarence Easter from Manitoba on yesterday, and he's in favor of this. But, you know, I don't know, again, if he's a majority opinion, minority opinion, or if it's split 50-50. But something you said earlier when you and Minister Alty had your scrum with reporters earlier, you were asked when we might see a list of projects. You said, I think it could be a long time. Did I hear you right? Like, the Prime Minister's talked about moving very fast at speed that we've considered unimaginable, but you say a long time. Help me understand.
I said a long wait, which means that we're not going to rush through this process. I also heard the Prime Minister say that we are going to do this right.
Yep.
We're going to co-develop, we're going to co-define, and we're going to make sure that the projects that do advance and come to fruition are the ones that have national interest, Indigenous interest in place. So everybody's criteria of a long wait is different. For mine, it means that we're waiting to do this process properly with engagement and dialogue with Indigenous people.
Right, but can we move that time frame out of, say, the dictionary and into a calendar? Are we talking weeks? Are we talking months? Because, you know, the Prime Minister is going to meet with the premiers next week, and the premiers are going to meet, and they want to go fast. They want projects named by Labor Day, if they can, some of them. Do you think we're still on that kind of timeline? Because with the urgency that a lot of people felt to move on this stuff, especially with what Donald Trump is doing, if it starts to slow down, you can see the potential for tension and fracture. So, I mean, what's your sense of how quickly this will actually start moving?
By Labor Day, I think the major projects office being established, receiving information from individuals, this is the target. What that's going to look like in terms of whatever discussion comes out of the Premier, you know, I can't give a timeline, but I know that quickly making sure that we respond to the situation that we're in, because we're all affected. You know, Canadians are affected, Indigenous peoples are affected of what we see happening in an international space with the economy. We have to respond to that. We have to protect ourselves and defend ourselves.
What is your next step now, though? You know, there are people who are leaving here today very unconvinced, skeptical. Some actually feel worse about what they said. So clearly there's some more work to be done. You know, my colleague Nigan Sinclair was on earlier, and he suggested that the Prime Minister should go across the country and hold a series of like regional meetings and really sort of have that level of interaction. Is that something you would do? Do you know what you do next beyond these summits? Because clearly something's got to be done.
All good dialogue starts with a summit. So we will be doing Indigenous, Inuit, and then Métis. And after that, yes, the Prime Minister will be ensuring that the next steps are regional discussions. We'll be looking at different lenses in that dialogue. What does your governance look like? What does your territory look like? What is the level of interest? How do you foresee your participation? I think those next critical conversations are going to really refine the information that we're looking for and give us more guidance.
What if the feedback you get is the law needs changes? Because the Prime Minister said he's not really keen on doing that. I mean, you can get the office up and running and still then tweak things after the fact. I mean, is your government open to any kind of amendment on this? Because a lot of the Indigenous groups we've heard from, they never got to speak at committee. They felt the consultation process at the front end was rushed. Can there be a change now, even though it's gotten royal assent?
You know, as an Indigenous person, I can understand why that question is being raised. As somebody who now is within government, I think for me, I see that the definition, the opportunity to really clarify definition and work together allows for Indigenous people to really clarify what the intent is. So, you know, that question has been raised. I haven't heard an answer, but for me, there's opportunity in this situation for Indigenous people to really put their mark on this act by engagement, by participating, and, you know, being involved in the next step. I think that's really critical.
Being involved in the next step, but did you create extra next steps by not having them involved more in the front end? You know, Natan Obed sat right there a few weeks back, the leader of the ITK, and he expressed deep frustration with not even being able to speak at the committee that was studying the legislation. I mean, was it a mistake to move as fast as you did through the legislative process and not take some of the consultation in, at least from the big three national organizations at the front end?
Ideally, more time is what makes for a good quality product. But ideally in this situation, when the pressure is so high, when we see everything changing and evolving, almost requiring a daily or weekly response, we have to be cognizant that we're in a situation where we are also defending ourselves, defending the Indigenous interests and how they could be impacted by changes in the economy. The goal is to protect people. And I think in this instance, that decision was made with the best interests of Canadians and Indigenous people.
No, the best intentions I can understand, but there's a quick process and then there's a rushed process. I mean, how can you be confident this wasn't rushed? Because we did see some frustration today, and it is the pace at which you moved, regardless of the intentions. It has created a skepticism, if not a doubt.
I can understand that, but you know, I think Canadians were very clear in who they chose their leader to be. And we see a Prime Minister who is committed, who is open, who wants to move forward, made statements that we have to do things in a big way. We need to build a Canada strong, and is ambitiously looking to ensure that partners come to the table. And I hope that there's an interest to do that. And I hope that Indigenous people want to take that next step with us and ensure that, you know, their Indigenous economies are reflected in a Canadian economy, because that's what's important to me as a minister.
Okay, well, Minister, good luck. You've got your work cut out for you. That's the Minister of Indigenous Services, Mandy Gull-Masty. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Hundreds of First Nations gathered across the river in Gatineau today to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney and to air their concerns about his major projects bill and the impact it could have on Indigenous communities and treaties. Speaking after the First Nations Summit wrapped today, Indigenous Services Minister Mandy Gull-Masty responded to those concerns.
The outcome of these projects is for Indigenous interest to be there. So it requires Indigenous participation. The likelihood of these projects advancing or being completed without Indigenous people at the table, we heard the Prime Minister in this session, it is, I want to say almost, but to me sounded like zero.
The Assembly of First Nations National Chief, Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, joins me now. National Chief, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I just wonder if we could start with the comments there from Minister Gull-Masty. How reassured are you with that? That sounds to me like if First Nations and Indigenous people are not on board, a project just won't get fast-tracked. Do you read it that way?
Well, I think that that's the reality, right?
Yeah.
I think any smart project in any smart company and government, whether that's provincial or federal, need to have conversations with First Nations in this country. First Nations are founding partners to every square inch of this country, from coast to coast to coast. And look, they're not against, progress, and opportunity and development. First Nations have always been very generous, but not at the expense of our rights. And I think, coming together today was a good thing.
Okay, so do you think the outcome of this was a good thing? Because you said yesterday ahead of the summit that First Nations and Canada are at a critical point in the nation-to-nation relationship. Do you think Canada met the moment with this summit?
I think Canada learned some things through this summit this week. I know that we've been debating back and forth, and I'm glad that they had answered the call. I know the Prime Minister and I had long conversations, and I said, look, you've got to meet with First Nations directly. Mm-hmm. Did they do everything perfectly this week and today? Absolutely not. But I'm glad that he had tried, and I think, First Nations leadership in the room today stood up for him at the end of the day, because for the first time we've seen a Prime Minister sit down with First Nations for a full day. Is that going to solve the last 150 years of this country? No, but I think that it's a good start. And, we heard from various voices from First Nations leadership across the country. I know that he's also had a commitment to go across the country from region to region. I'm glad to hear that. And I think that there's so many long outstanding grievances, issues, land issues, so many issues that we have to work through in this country. And right. I'm glad that we're at the table talking through them. They're not pretty conversations, and it's sometimes tough to hear those conversations, but at the same time, by Canadians, First Nations working together, we'll come out of this.
Because some chiefs came out of that meeting today feeling worse than when they went in. That's certainly the comments they made. Senator Prosper and a series of chiefs, I think, from Alberta, had a press conference today, and they were not charitable in their assessment of how this went. So, do you think this moved people closer to an ability to work together on advancing the projects, or did it set it back in some parts?
Well, first of all, we don't know what projects
right.
we're talking about yet. We're talking about a bill at the moment, right? Bill 5 and what that looks like. And look, we call on the government to, reconsider some of the statements that they've seen today in making that bill stronger. And I think all Canadians should always work towards that, including First Nations, environmentalists. When we leave laws in this country, all of us, we're all middle-aged, we need to make sure when we leave laws that we leave them strong enough for our children and our grandchildren. And I think, when laws like this are rushed, this is the end result of it. But at the same time, I know that there was lots of discussion today about how to make it stronger, how to add more wording, and I hope the federal government takes that into consideration and makes this stronger.
But it's not just a bill now. It is the law of the land. It has received royal assent, and the Prime Minister suggested today that amending it, not really something he saw as necessary. So how do you reconcile the government's seeming determination to keep this as it is, to move ahead as quickly as they can, with the desire of First Nations, Inuit, Métis, to make sure that they're heard and protected here?
Look, I'm not speaking for any other group except First Nations, and I think
sure.
It's so important that if there is a project, that First Nations are spoken to, right? Even if it's a thought from a company or an exploration company or, the government, whether that be provincial or federal, that they're in communities talking to First Nations people directly about what project they're thinking of. And I think, First Nations are asking for that, to make sure that this country respects them. For far too long, this country has divvied up natural resources without ever thinking about First Nations people. So I think today was a good first start.
Right.
We have to have a further, I've called on them to meet in 1 year again to find out how far we're progressing with each other with the relationship, and to not wait 13 years. I think the last time we had a discussion with any Prime Minister was 13 years ago, prior to that in the 80s. And I think that that's too far apart. I think that it's so important that we meet on a more regular basis with nation-to-nation First Nations, with the Crown itself, to work through some of these issues ahead of time, right. Not after the fact.
Right. And look, I apologize if I was trying to get you to speak for the Inuit or the Métis. I just wanted to remind the audience it's a broader conversation as well. But, one of the tensions here, National Chief, is the duty to consult, set out in Section 35 and reinforced by Supreme Court decisions and defined, an inescapable obligation for the Government of Canada. But then there is the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. One is the law of the land. One is aspirational in terms of its incorporation, but not necessarily a certain standard that needs to be met. What do you make of the Prime Minister's reassurance that it is actually baked into the legislation, that this is the intention here by the government to get the free, prior, informed consent? Is that reassuring to you?
Look, I think that we have to see what projects that they have in mind. And I know that we've been asking them to that. And at the end of the day, of course, the Prime Minister said, we don't have that list yet. And, when there is that list, that people are open about it and that the federal government is open about what's on that list and where they're intending to build, and to make sure that any impacted First Nations around this country, that especially in that traditional area, wherever that project is to be located, projects of national interest, that First Nations in that area are spoken to. And I think that for far too long, things get built and nobody ever talks to First Peoples, and things end up in court that way. And look, we've got to improve our relationship with each other. Is it going to be easy to have these conversations? Absolutely not. But we do have to change the way things are. We have a $350 billion infrastructure gap in this country that we again stressed today.
Right.
And we also need to remember that we have that balance to make sure that when we're talking about resources of this country, that some of those resources go back directly to First Nations, because why do children on reserve have less than those off reserve? They need access to proper health care, proper education facilities like schools, and basic things that our kids, we talked about our sons earlier.
Yep.
Our children need access to high-speed internet and cell phone service, and many of our First Nations communities don't even have those basic necessities that Canadians take for granted, including water. And so how do we fix this country so that our children and grandchildren aren't having these same conversations 30 years from now?
Wab Kinew, the Premier of Manitoba, made this point in Saskatoon, I think it was, that there is an opportunity here to help some of the poorest kids in Canada if you get this right. So the question is ensuring it's done right. We've got about 40 seconds, but Grand Chief Fiddler was just here, and he said he just doesn't trust them. How widespread is that? Do people just not trust Prime Minister Carney and his government in the First Nations leadership, or is it a trust deficit? How would you describe it?
It's absolutely a trust deficit. Look, it's a trust deficit leading back to the, treaties were signed, relationships were built, and then a decade later, there's the Indian Act put down, the throats of First Nations. And I think that trust is a very delicate thing, and it needs to be built, and it needs to be strengthened. And I think by sitting down today was one good start, but that can't be the be-all, end-all. We have to continue on meeting. We need to continue on speaking with each other and working through some of these really tough issues and having the tough conversations very openly and transparently. So, thank you.
Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse, Nepinak, I appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.